Greece, when it splits, makes life complicated from a prophetic sense. But pagan Rome has to deal with both of these powers, both of these kingdoms. Okay? So have I lost anybody there?
Just this last point. So the purpose of all those details, you mean details of the transition between Greece and Rome?
All the details in chapter 11, it goes into a lot of depth. Some of the reasons, a lot of the reason of the information that's given is because of this complexity that occurs because of the split.
One of the reasons, the origin of this.
Yes. The other thing that I mentioned yesterday evening is that we get so used to looking at these prophecies and these events, and I think I've been guilty of this, that we're so used to looking at information that stimulates us, that the basic information that's there that proves that we should be more familiar with, which would give us the confidence that the scriptures are really the true word of God. I don't think we spend enough time focusing upon them. How many of us here have actually really looked at the throw-by-throw battle that goes on in verses 3, 4, right up to verse 15, where we see all the intricacies of what those verses mean and checked out the history to actually see that they were true? Has anybody ever done that here? Yeah? 1 or 2 people have. But for the vast majority of us, we just say, from my experience, we ignore all of those verses. We say, oh, we know it's all true. Let's get on to Daniel 11, 45, or some other issue, some other subject, without actually verifying that all the other information is true. What if you found that, for instance, verse 12 in Daniel 11 wasn't fulfilled, it never occurred? It's not there, it's a lie. How would that make you think, or make you feel about any kind of understanding of verses 40 to 45, which are future? The whole point of prophecy is that when you have things that have been prophesied and have come true, you're able to stand upon those truths, so that when you see things which are about to occur, you can be certain that those things are going to occur in the way that they are. And I think because we don't spend the time checking that all this information is correct, I think we lose out on the blessing. And it really is a spiritual blessing that we're losing out on. I would really recommend, and we're just going to really skim through this information. And I haven't done any resources study on it, but as an example, when we get to say, when we do verse 2, for instance, when we do verse 2, and it's going to take us about 3 or 4 minutes just to go through verse 2, I probably spent 30 hours or something researching the information just for verse 2, just to make sure that all that history is correct, and it ties in and it works from all the secular history, and it's in accordance with what the Word is teaching. So, things just look really straightforward, but it takes an awful amount of time and effort to establish that what the Scriptures are teaching are really true. And we've become so lazy that we say, well, Uriah Smith did that for us. Or some other commentator, Adam Clark, or there's hundreds of people who've done this work, and they've all come to virtually the same conclusion up to about verse 15. And so we say, well, they've all done the work for us, we don't need to check it. But you'll find that there's differences of views, there's small mistakes, but it's just like the parable of the 10 virgins. You can't take the oil from someone else, and you're missing out on an experience by not studying these things out for yourself. You are really required to go, and you have all the tools now available online or in libraries, to go back and just check that the history that's given in these verses is correct. And it takes a lot of time and effort, and most people say they can't be bothered to do that. And by not bothering to do that, I think you leave yourself exposed that when you come to these later verses, which are talking about things that are going on now and in the future, you end up taking a position that you have to take someone's word for what's happening. You have to essentially believe me that what I'm saying is correct, and my understanding of those verses, because you have no real confidence in the Word of God, because you haven't placed any weight upon that. Again, you've trusted Uriah Smith's or Adam Clark's or another commentator's work to say verse 6 means this and verse 12 means that. And if you haven't checked it yourself, you're going to be in trouble. Let me put it that way. Ellen White says only those who have diligently studied the Word of God will be able to stand. And if you're relying upon the work of other people, even great men like those, and there are many, many others, both in the church and outside of the church, you're going to be in trouble. And what you'll find is when you do that research, you'll actually see that the vast majority of these commentators are just copying the work of other men. It's very few of the, very little of the work is original. Very little of Uriah Smith's work is original work. He's collating information and events that are going on in his day and putting that information into his commentary on this chapter specifically. And I'm not saying it's incorrect to do that, but if we just rely upon that without verifying those things ourselves, we're missing out on a great spiritual experience which we're required, I believe we're required, each of us individually, to do. And we can make hundreds of excuses that we're a woman, that we're uneducated, we don't have time, we've got children, we've got work, we've got hundreds of one things, we've got other things to study, we should be studying the gospel. There's so many reasons not to do it, but if you don't, you're going to be ending up exposing yourself to this one problem that you're going to go on audio verse, so you're going to come to meetings like this, and you will hear people presenting information, and at the end of the day, you won't know for yourself what is the truth and what isn't. What's going to be based upon? How clever they were, their education, what? That's the problem that you're faced with.
So even when Sister White says that Uriah Smith's book, Daniel Revelation, is got some kind, we shouldn't use that.
We shouldn't?
We shouldn't use that to incorporate Bible study.
Sorry, if you can ask a question, use the mic.
Yeah, so the question was, even though Sister White says that Uriah Smith's Daniel Revelation, the book, is God's helping hand, should we not use that for Bible study to help us to understand Daniel, the books of Daniel Revelation?
I'm not suggesting that, but what I am saying, if we rely upon that and use that as the Word of God, or the correct interpretation of those verses, without verifying the information ourselves first, we expose ourselves to problems.
So it can be incorporated into the study.
Yes, if you look at his commentary on some of the verses, they're very well done. I mean, he gives quite a lot of information, but you have to make sure that the information is correct. And in some cases, I don't think it is correct. And even if it were correct, that's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is you become like Jesus through studying His Word. You don't become like Jesus by listening to sermons, by hearing other people's thoughts and ideas of what the Word teaches. You have to go to the Word yourself directly. And that's the point I'm trying to make. Without studying, whatever the subject is, if you don't study for yourself and rely upon other people, you will be caught out in the end. And the reason you'll be caught out is not only because there's heresy being taught, and I don't mean that in an aggressive way, but you'll be caught out because you won't have an experience with Jesus. And that's the big problem. Because you don't need to study these verses. I'm going to give you the information, and from my understanding, the information I'll give you for Daniel 11:40-45 is correct. But I have to add a clause. You can take my word for that. Okay? Because that's all you can do really, is take my word for it. Unless you go to Jesus yourself and look at these verses yourself, you can't have the confidence that it's correct. And you have to go back into history, have that confidence before you can have the confidence to know what's in the future. That's the point I'm wanting to make. That you really need to do that. If you don't, you're doing yourself a disservice and you will fall away by and by. It's almost guaranteed. No matter how much you know about 11:40-45, you will not make the spiritual preparation that you need without spending time in the Word, looking at other portions. And one of the fundamental things we're required to do is to look at prophecy that's already been fulfilled, so we know how to behave. in respect to prophecy that is to be fulfilled. And we read that about the disciples. The disciples were able to do the work in time of Pentecost because they already understood the prophecies that had been fulfilled in the time of Christ. That's how they were prepared to do the work. And we are lacking in that. And you have to do that work yourself. You can't rely upon other people who have done it.
I've dealt with that a lot.
I think I have dealt with doubts a lot, and if I understood correctly what you said in the beginning, is that, for example, if any preacher quotes a book of history to prove that the event happened according to prophecy, if we don't check that book of history ourselves, just reading a quote, and what conviction can we have from that? So, is that what we're trying to say? We have to see in the books of history for ourselves the fulfillment of those prophecies, and not just from the quotes of any writer or...
Yes.
Yeah, and so, yeah, it's true that it needs to be done. I've dealt with doubts, and when I didn't have those elements, convictions, I saw that all I had heard and read was not enough. I needed to check for myself. What
you'll find is, in the scale of things, there's this much history, okay, and there's this much prophecy. And when you've got this much prophecy, this much history, you have to select the history that fits into the prophecy. And there's many ways to do that. If you've looked at any kind of discussion of the Millerites, one of the arguments that they had to deal with when they were dealing with Daniel chapter 8, who was Antiochus Epiphanes. That little horn power, was it Antiochus Epiphanes or was it the papacy? Yeah? And if you select history, and the same argument is in Daniel 11, by the way, the argument about the papacy and Antiochus Epiphanes, the same arguments are there. There's plenty of history that you could get almost all the events of Daniel 11 and make them fit into the history of Antiochus Epiphanes, okay, who was, I believe, the fourth kingdom, the fourth king of this portion of this kingdom here, okay? And that's the danger that you find. If you read Uriah Smith's work, and we're going to deal with that as we go through, when he gets to verse 36, and if you remember the thing I gave you, verse 36 I said was where? Halfway into the papal reign, isn't it? Yeah? I said 31 to 40, yeah? So it's halfway into the papal reign that he introduces a whole new concept and idea, and he uses the events that are occurring around him and history to bolster his argument. So he has this much history, and he selectively picks up information, puts it into the Bible, and says, I've got it to fit. And he does get it to fit. But how do you know he's incorrect? That's the point you need to understand. How do you know he's incorrect? How do you know he's corrected the correct history or the incorrect? The only way you know is by taking a step back and say, does it fit the structure? Does it fit the structure that you're dealing with 4 kingdoms, the last kingdom is in 2 phases? Without that, you are, like in the middle of the sea without a map.
You think that's when he's introducing Turkey as a king of the north?
That's right. Yes, and we'll deal with that. So, the point I want to... So just following that, I've given a basic overview. I just want to introduce this idea of Greece. Greece splits between the north and the south. Okay? And if you go to the book of... If you go to Daniel 11, you'll see this term over and over again. It's called the King of the North and the King of the South. Okay? You'll see that term over and over again, the King of the North and the King of the South. And the King of the North and the King of the South, in the first half of Daniel 11, is talking about Greece after it had split. Okay? It's slightly more complex than that, but this is a very condensed, accurate concept and understanding of how Greece split. It goes into 2 kingdoms, the King of the North and the King of the South. Let me give you the names of the kingdoms for this. Okay? This is Syria.